I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction to how we should think about this question. And the introduction begins sometime before 1846, something written somewhere near Walden Pond by this man, Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau wrote this: "There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root." So we all know the branches of evil. They're all around us, right? For example, this is the picture of a 14-year-old boy. It's a picture of an epidemic in America of childhood obesity. 3 times the number of kids since 1980 are now technically obese. More than 1/3 over the age of 2 are obese. This epidemic has costs. One of the most amazing costs is for type 2 diabetes, a kind of diabetes that used to afflict only old people. Now half of all new cases come from kids. Total cost to America is $147 billion in direct health care costs every year. Now, why is it we've seen this explosion in childhood obesity? Well, when I was a kid, I was fat. I called it genetic. It was a genetic problem. But it's a little bit hard to imagine a whole generation of kids having a genetic problem with obesity. It's not, in fact, a genetic problem. It's because of what we eat. There's a consensus among people who know something about this that we eat too much of this stuff, not enough of this stuff. And it's not actually too much of sugar that we eat. We eat way too much of this thing called high fructose corn syrup. 40% of the stuff in your supermarket has high fructose corn syrup in it today. Why is that, you might wonder? The simple answer is that the cost of sugar is high relative to the cost of corn. And the free market types might look at that and say, well, that's just what the market requires. It's just the way costs and benefits get spread. But it's not quite so simple, this story. The cost of sugar is extremely high in America because tariffs protect 6 domestic sugar manufacturers. Those tariffs give them about $1 billion in extra profit every year while costing the American economy $3 billion in inefficiency because sugar costs 2 to 3 times the amount that it costs in other countries around the world. And corn is so cheap in America because we subsidize the production of corn, $74 billion over the last 15 years. Meaning, as some economists calculate it, the cost of producing corn in America is negative. It pays to produce corn. So you take these 2 facts about the sugar tariff and the corn subsidy, and it produces a radical shift in the costs of food. So between 1997 and 2003, the cost of vegetables went up by 17%, while the cost of a Big Mac went down by 5.4%, and the cost of a bottle of Coke went down by 35%. And then it also produces a radical shift in how food gets made. I'm sure many of you saw this extraordinary film, Food, Inc., which talks about the fact that because corn is so cheap, it's profitable to produce cattle in this factory farm-like way. But it's not so profitable for cows because, of course, the stomachs of cows can't really digest corn properly. So they've got to feed the cows literally tons of antibiotics to deal with the diseases that get produced when they eat corn rather than grass. Which means that we have a plentiful number of these new bugs, increasingly bugs that antibiotics can't deal with, producing salmonella, which if this were a film, I would then cut to some 4-year-old boy who died because he ate a hamburger that had a salmonella poisoning that could not be stopped. All of these changes because we've made corn so cheap and sugar so dear. Now you might look at this and say, why is there such anti-free market silliness going on here? And I could say, well, who are we to say? But this is what we know. An extraordinary amount of campaign cash drives to these 2 crazy points. First, sugar manufacturers giving millions to candidates to make sure they continue to protect sugar, and ADM leading the charge in forcing Congress to lower the cost of corn through subsidies. And if it's because of these campaign contributions, then we can say campaign money distorts the market that distorts food production, which distorts our kids. I think of this example, Wall Street, the worst of these examples. There was, of course, an extraordinary collapse on Wall Street 2 years ago. Why was there such a collapse? Well, the story is told in this fantastic book by Simon Johnson and James Quack. Their book begins with understanding the collapse that happened around the time of the Depression. It goes something like this. There was a really bad depression. That depression inspired a government to embrace a simple principle when it came to financial services. The principle was oversight. Oversight when money is involved. So every single major instrument of that economy, bonds, stocks, savings, were supervised, or you could say regulated, by three principles. That they would be public, that they would be transparent, and they would be subject to anti-fraud requirements. In the 1990s, there was an innovation in thinking about the financial services sector. The innovation was deregulation of the financial sector. Heck, it worked for airlines, why not for banks? So new financial instruments were now private. They were not subject to public, transparent, anti-fraud requirements. So I asked Frank Partnoy, who is a scholar in this area, to calculate the consequence of this. And he said to me in 1980, 98% of the financial instruments in our economy were subject to these basic oversight requirements. In 2008, 90% were exempt from these basic oversight requirements. This shadow banking industry encouraged this bubble, but even that wasn't enough for the deregulation mavens. They also wanted a little bit of re-regulation. A certain kind of government guarantee, signaled indirectly through the Fed and changes in the regulatory system, that when this bubble burst, there would be a bailout on the other end. They got that guarantee, producing perhaps the dumbest system of socialist ever created by man, socializing the risk but privatizing the benefits. An insanely stupid financial system. Now, why is it we produce this? Well, who are we to say? This is what we know. The fastest growing industry in campaign contributions over the last 25 years has been the financial services sector. Or here's another example, very vivid to you, of course, the Deepwater Horizon explosion and then spill. Many people look at this and say, how is it such an accident could happen? Aren't there environmental impact studies or risk evaluations that would have said that such a experimental drilling should have been more carefully protected? I mean, after all, in my area of the country, we've just spent 9 years and 10,000 pages of environmental impact studies just to build a green energy wind system to generate electricity. So when you look at something like the Deepwater Horizon, you might think to yourself, how much studying did they have to do for that? The answer was they had to submit 17 pages of analysis before they were exempted from any further studies to evaluate the impact of that innovation. Now, of course, when Congress looked at this, Congress was, as they said, shocked, and it evokes...
I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in here.
You're winning, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. Everybody out at once.
But yet, of course, it was Congress that had required this system of oversight, this approval within 30 days of submitting something to get a deep water-like drilling permission. Now, why did they require this? Well, who are we to say? What we know is endless campaign cash here led to this crazy public policy. Or think about global warming. We have had 2 years of Democratic control in Congress with supermajorities in the House and almost supermajority in the Senate, and a president who promised he would would do something about this. $110 million spent by organizations around the country pushing global warming legislation, but just in July, the Senate Majority Leader says they are going to abandon the idea of global warming legislation in this Congress. Why? Who are we to say? What we know is endless campaign cash pushing to this end. And then, of course, there's health care. Some people look at the healthcare debate and they say, this just shows that Barack has changed D.C. My friend Ezra Klein of the Washington Post wrote this piece about the twilight of the interest groups. As he said, the Obama administration succeeded in neutralizing every single industry. Oh yeah, right. My view is closer to Glenn Greenwald's. Here's what Glenn said. If by neutralizing, Ezra means bribing and accommodating them to such an extreme degree that they ended up affirmatively supporting a bill that lavishes them with massive benefits, then of course he's absolutely right. The way this bill has been shaped is the ultimate expression and bolstering of how Washington has long worked. One can find reasonable excuses for why it had to be done that way, but one cannot reasonably deny that it was. Evoking the words of the 20th century's greatest philosopher, David Byrne, who said, "Same as it ever was." In all these cases, what we've got here is evil branches. And what we need to ask is, how do we find the root? Now, everybody here knows what the root to these problems is. It's cash. Not the kind of cash that inspired Blagojevich, not the kind of cash that gets handed around in brown paper bags. We're not talking about bribery. We're not talking about improper influence that criminal laws try to address. Instead, we're talking about the so damn much money, as Robert Kaiser puts it in his extraordinary book, that produces this sick economy of influence that is Washington, where lobbyists depend upon members, who depend upon special interests, who depend upon the lobbyists to produce this system of influence that corrupts our government. Everybody knows that this system of influence produces a system of dependence, where members become dependent upon lobbyists who are dependent upon these special interests, meaning the special interests begin to control in marionette-like ways our Congress. Everybody here knows that the only way we're going to strike at the roots of this problem is to find a way to cut that connection between the special interests and our Congress. And everybody here knows that the only way we're going to do that is an idea that a Republican had more than 100 years ago, citizen-funded elections. And I hope that everybody here knows that we are extraordinarily close to having the first time in 40 years that the American Congress has actually embraced this idea with the imminent passage in the House of the Fair Elections Now Act, a statute that would give candidates the chance to prove that their decisions are not because of the money, because the only money they get are small dollar contributions from their constituents. And that fight to get that bill passed in the House after it was passed last Thursday in the House Administration Committee is a fight that you need to be part of by going to the site Fair Elections Now, or you can go to our site Fix Congress First and find the representatives who still need to be convinced so that Nancy Pelosi can deliver on her promise to bring this to the House before this election. Now, everybody knows all this, but some people believe that this inside the Beltway strategy alone can never actually win this fight. That the people inside the Beltway have too much to lose and they have too much to offer those who actually control these votes, so that this inside the Beltway strategy alone will fail. That instead what we need is an inside America strategy, right, where we recognize Washington is not us. We need to persuade America, us, friend to friend, peer to peer, that this fundamental reform is needed. We need to focus America on this route at which we must strike. Now, we believe this here, today, is an example of that conversation. We need to identify and debate with civility a value at the core of the Coffee Party movement, how to make democracy work. And as more and more begin to see the product of movements and events like this, maybe these mock conventions can become something real. Because a real convention is what our framers intended when they crafted the Constitution. Article 5 of the Constitution explicitly includes a provision to permit the calling of a convention for the purpose of proposing amendments, and they imagined that would be the strategy when the insiders lose touch with the rest of the American people. When the insiders lose touch, the outsiders were to reach in. And if we can get 2/3 of states, 34 states, to make this call for a convention, then we can have this platform to debate and resolve this in a way the insiders don't control. Now, people look at this and they say, but there's never been a convention under Article 5. That's technically true, but it misses a very important point. The only time in the history of America when our Congress changed its internal corrupt system was the 17th Amendment. And the only reason there was a 17th Amendment is that the call for a convention in the states came within one state of being enough. And when Congress realized that these outsiders were about to have a convention, they were scared to death. And when they were scared to death, they quickly passed the 17th Amendment that they thought would staunch the reform movement. And in 1913, that amendment was ratified, and the push for a constitutional convention was stopped. Now, even if you don't get to the number we need, 34, what we believe is you terrify the insiders to begin to deliver the kind of reform that would satisfy us. And if we had that kind of fear in Washington, we might actually get something done. Now, we need a movement here, a citizens' movement, but recognizing citizens have different goals, recognizing citizens with different goals are not the enemy. It is this system of government that is the enemy. And as we build this movement, we need to recognize that allies in an effective movement can be extraordinarily diverse. Think of the diversity among these key allies in World War II. They faced a common enemy and defeated that common enemy despite their differences. So as people look at the Tea Party, as much as we get angry at the particular things they say or the particular things they want, we need to recognize the Tea Party is not the enemy. Despite their extremism, it is their passion and a strategy here that can be used to fight a common enemy that we have with them.
I feel we have a corporate-funded election system.
Corporations are completely running our government right now.
Our election system is corporate-funded.
Big money plays a huge role in elections right now.
This is a much bigger problem than Republican, Democrats.
BP, Goldman Sachs, Massey Energy, all these companies are perfect examples of corporations gaming the books and manipulating the rules.
There is just no way that these politicians can tell us that that money does not have an effect.
Big money definitely affects the Republican Party, and we're just as sick about that as we are about the effects it has on the Democratic Party.
They're all being elected because they have the money.
We need a government of the people, for the people, and by the people.
Elections held by just regular people and not funded by big companies is a very good idea.
I'm all in favor of the Fair Elections Act. Only little people, small people, us people, can give to the local officials.
If we could change the way we fund elections, it would make a tremendous difference.
Elections should be funded by the people.
Anyone you could talk to, I think, would be in favor of that, knowing that their votes would begin to count.
Fair elections are essential to have any hope of a functioning government.
Passing the fair elections law would be a huge step.
The Fair Elections Now Act is absolutely something that I would vote for.
I would feel like we maybe can take back our democracy.
Republicans and Democrats, I would hope, would support fair elections.
It takes the power of money out of the voting process. Yes, bring it back to the people.
There are not common goals here between the Tea Party and us, or me. Maybe some of you are members of the Tea Party. If you are, welcome. There's not common goals between people on the right and people on the left. But we need to find a way to teach America there is a common enemy, and to draw together to fight that common enemy. And if we win, we will win for a reason that the last serious reform movement in America won. Because we should remember, as we stand here in Louisville, Kentucky, a movement called the Progressive Movement. Today, many people look at that movement and say it was a liberal movement. It was not a liberal movement. The reformers in that movement came from the right and the left. Reformers. Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican. The leader of the National Progressive Republican League, Bob La Follette from Wisconsin, brought down William Howard Taft, a Republican president. It was Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat. And it was a man from this city, Louis Brandeis, who had voted and supported both Democrats and Republicans as he became, in my view, the most important, really the most brilliant of these progressives. People from all across the political spectrum united to this common view that their government had become corrupted by special interests, by the gilded interests of the day. The democracy had been sold to them. And astonishingly, 100 years ago, the election of 1912, that movement had the chance to prove their claim on the American public. And there were 4 candidates running for president. There was Eugene Debs, the socialist. There was William Howard Taft, the Republican stand pat, what's good for business is good for America. There was Teddy Roosevelt, who came back from the wilderness to run against his Republican friend Taft for the Bull Moose Party. And there was Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat. Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt were progressives. Between the two of them, they garnered 70% of the vote in the national election. And Woodrow Wilson, the small government, pro-liberty, progressive candidate, beat Teddy Roosevelt by 15 points. Now, I think we must build this neo-progressive movement. That might not be the right term given how terrible people misunderstand the word progressive, but it's the right idea. We need to build that movement right here in Brandeis's hometown right now, recognizing these different ends, recognizing we have a common means to solve this called democracy and a common enemy called corruption. The Tea Party likes to look back to the founding and tell us we had a republic. We did. And by republic, the framers meant a representative democracy. And in Federalist 52, they told us what a representative democracy would look like. It was a democracy where the House would be a branch of government which ought to be dependent upon the people alone. We don't have a Congress dependent upon the people alone. The people have been replaced by the funders. This should be our mantra, right? The funders. Can you say that? The funders are not the people. The funders are not the people. Once again, he's going to get it on film. The funders are not the people. Okay, now here's the end. So some people picked on me today because I'm wearing these funny shoes. These are Keds. Here's why I'm wearing Keds. I've decided to wear Keds every time I talk about this issue because Keds are made by this company, StrideRight. This company, StrideRight, was started by this man, Arnold Hyatt. So Arnie is a very humble guy. The only picture on the internet of him is this tiny little picture. You can't even make him out. He's a loyal Democrat, Arnie Hyatt is. And in 1996, he was the second largest contributor to the Democratic Party. So President Clinton, grateful for the contributions of Arnie and other rich fat cats, decided he would invite 30 of them to a dinner at the Mayflower Hotel, a dinner of these fat cats. And he would invite these fat cats to explain to him what they thought government should do. So one by one, they went around the room, all 30 of them speaking, and Arnie was the last speaking. We don't have a picture of it. I kind of imagine it kind of like this, as he stood up to speak to the president. And so Arnie stood up and he said to President Clinton, "Mr. President, I know that you're an admirer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So I want you to put yourself in Roosevelt's shoes in 1939, when he came to recognize that he needed to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy." Because Arnie said, "Mr. President, you too have to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. Not a war against fascists, a war against fat cats. People like us. People who believe that they, simply because they are rich, have the right to direct and control our government." Now, as you can imagine, there's a little bit of silence in the room after Arnie was finished. The only published account we have of this event reports that after he was finished, Clinton effectively slashed Hyatt to pieces, humiliating him in front of the group. Because we were not going to come to power and then unilaterally disarm. We were going to use the system to get the ends which we wanted. Well, I think 14 years later, it's time for us to recognize it was Arnold Hyatt who was right. That we all have to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. And borrowing from the last great Republican president, we could say, a great civil war, as in the sort of civility you guys care so much about. That kind of civil war, right? A war which would test whether that nation or any other nation so conceived can long endure. What was that test? For us to be here dedicated to the great task before us. What is the task? The task to see whether the government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. Of, by, and for the people, not the funders. Please join us in that. Thank you very much. Thank you. That's it.